Hey everybody, this is Bo Sanders, and for the last couple months I have been trying to listen in and observe what exactly is the outrage over critical race theory, specifically in the conservative or evangelical Christian circles. And listening to critics and those who are concerned can be very eye-opening if you try to understand the actual disagreement and what's behind the outrage and what's the inflammatory elements that are going on. So I've tried to take this in for the last couple months, and I found some interesting themes that have developed, including the Bible, the issue of worldview, identity politics and a confusion of categories, hammer and nail thinking of making everything about race, the boogeyman of Marx, and then lastly, this utopian expectation, which we will get to, and is a very strange accusation. Just let me say as we begin this, that if you don't want to do something, almost anything is a good excuse not to do it. Like if you get invited for dinner, you can say, oh, I have something else, or I just ate, or I have to clean my house, or I didn't make anything. I mean, it really doesn't matter. If you don't want to do something, anything is a sufficient excuse not to do it. Now, having said that, there are some actual objections to critical race theory, specifically in Christian circles. The big one is that the Bible becomes a barrier. So if you think in versification as verification or versification as validation, I have a Bible verse and therefore, right, I don't have to address any new information or a different approach. This is a very real problem, because if you can say, well, critical race theory can't be true because Bible or because Jesus, and this happens over and over again. This is a major barrier. Just this week, somebody said critical race theory can't be true because Jesus said in John 8:34, I think it is, that anyone who sins is a slave to sin. So we are all slaves to sin, and therefore critical race theory, because it's based on the oppressed and the oppressor, done. Argument settled. And you just think, this is not that hard to resolve. Yeah, we're all slaves to sin, and therefore we participate in systems of oppression because we are enslaved. Or we are victims of that oppression because of the same thing. So it's a root, right? It's an easy one to fix. It's a root that bears in this expression a fruit of racism and systemic systems like that. It's really not that hard. But when you have been taught to think this way, you say, well, Ephesians says this. Okay, so? Well, then critical race theory can't be true. Really? Okay, so that's the first one. The second one's a little grander in that Christianity is viewed as a worldview. So it's a totalizing, explanatory system to take care of explaining everything the way the world works and all sorts of other things. And then what happens is when something new is introduced, like the toolbox of critical race theory, which wants to analyze or interrogate, secondly, to explain or expose, and then thirdly, to advocate for change, it's seen as an adversarial worldview, and so it's projected out because it's not just a competing worldview, but an alternative, right? And so it's a strange thing when you think you have a biblical or a Christian worldview, that anything outside of that or new or different from that is then a different worldview. But this is a projection that just doesn't ring true. For instance, I do critical race theory in my critical whiteness approach, but as a Christian minister. And so one is a complement or a supplement to the other, and it doesn't need to be seen as a competing worldview. This is an odd projection. The third major objection is that critical race theory, CRT, makes everything about race. And that it's a hammer and nail problem, that if your only tool in your belt is a hammer, you tend to see everything as a nail. But this is where intersectionality comes in, Because, yeah, there are issues of race. I mean, you cannot get around the historical legacy of race in this country. But intersectionality says, yeah, and it intersects or overlaps with issues of race and gender and sexuality and religion and so many other things. So this would be an easy one to not get bogged down in, because intersectionality helps us to see that while race is central to so many issues involving economics and education and legal matters, that to address race, I mean, you can't get around it. So even if you don't want that to be the only issue on the table, it certainly is an issue on the table. Which leads to the next objection, which is this binary thinking that gets from D'Angelo's White Fragility and Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist. This binary thing that you are either racist or you're anti-racist, right? And so the hackles get up and the defensiveness comes in. And then because it says, if you don't know that you're racist, you're even more racist than you realize, right? So people get upset about that. But one of the things that's really intriguing to me is that most of what people object to isn't actual critical race theory. It's actually overzealous identity politics. And this is a confusion of categories. By not understanding what identity politics is, then anything that deals with race gets lumped into this problem and this objection, and therefore it's like, I'm out. But you know what, I really think that if we removed D'Angelo and Kendi's binary approach to race, we could have a much different conversation. But people get very defensive and it's inflammatory, and then their ears shut down. Their hackles go up, their shoulders go up, and their defenses go up, and their ears shut down. And then there's the boogeyman of Marx. So the honest truth is, you can read a lot of critical race theory, I do, and never encounter Marx. Now, critical theory, the history of critical theory, sure. There's obviously the Marxist history there. But actually, most of what critical theory, not critical race theory, which is based more in legal approach and concerns, but critical theory in general, actually most of what gets quoted from Marx is from Hegel, the dialectic, and other things. And so it would be just as valid to say that we're all Hegelians at some level, but honestly, this boogeyman of Marx is thrown around because of Cold War and communism and then all that other stuff that I've covered before. But it really is a boogeyman, but the M word is thrown around quite heavily to scare people away. And honestly, it's just, you can read a lot of critical race theory, I would say exclusively, and never encounter Marx. The last objection I found that was truly strange, and by the way, famous pastors have been weighing in on this, not just institutions and magazines and websites and coalitions, but denominations, but famous pastors like Tim Keller and John MacArthur. But Keller, one of his objections is that it was utopian, which is just a very strange thing for a Christian to say, because one might object that Christianity is the most utopian of all sort of approaches and worldviews. So, I mean, the idea of Christ coming back, God judging the world, setting things to right, all of that stuff, that's very utopian. So the expectation of equality and equity in matters of race, for the utopian accusation to be thrown out was just a really weird, totally out of left field thing. I hope that this has been helpful. The honest truth is that if you, between the Bible and the binary thinking and the projection of worldview, if you don't want to engage in critical race theory, and I've said from the beginning, critical race theory is not for everyone, but if you don't want to do it, I don't honestly see that there's hope of this being resolved anytime soon. This is going to be an ongoing problem, because if you use the Bible as a barrier, if you project worldview onto conflicting data, if you So I would love to know your thoughts, any objections that you have or you have seen that I can address in a future video. And I look forward to hearing from you.